Hello, everybody. So today we are going to begin our discussion on the Cold War. So what we're going to be talking primarily about this time is the beginning events of the Cold War and basically up to where the Vietnam War is going to begin. So it's basically going to be a nice overview of the first big chunk. All right. So one of the first things is the Chinese Civil War. So you may remember from the World War II video and lecture that the Chinese were going through a civil war before World War II started, and then they had to fight the Japanese. So you have the communists in China as well as the democratic capitalistic side under Chiang Kai-shek, and you have the communists led by Mao Zedong. So these two sides, they are, now that the World War II is over, they're back at it. All right. So here's Mao and here's Chiang. But what's going to happen is in 1949, so just a few years after World War II is over, the communists are going to win and gain control of mainland China. So what's going to happen is Chiang Kai-shek and his people who are able to escape, they're going to move to the island of Taiwan, as you see on that map, is off the southeastern coast of China. It's a pretty decent sized island, and yeah, that's how we have modern day Taiwan. And China, they like to still claim that they own Taiwan, but Taiwan's an independent nation because they don't fall under a communist government, all that type of stuff. All right. Now, in Mao's China, basically everyone is expected to carry one of these little red books. And it is basically the rules that a good communist is supposed to follow. So, and you could get in severe trouble if you did not have this book on you, if you were asked for it. So, yeah, if you lived in Mao's China, you needed that book on you at all times. Now, the Korean War is going to be the first big test of the world in trying to prevent the spread of communism. Okay? This is a plan that Western powers are going to have in place. It's basically called containment, and and the U.S. is going to be one of the big supporters of this. We're the ones who really want to stop the spread of communism, and Korea is going to be our first big experiment on trying to keep it where it is. We basically have an agreement that we will not seek out to destroy communist countries, but we wish to prevent more countries from falling to communism. Okay, so Korea is the first big challenge. So one thing that you should know is Korea is known as the Forgotten War because it is overshadowed by two others. World War II, which was, just 5 years before, and then Vietnam, which is about 10 years after it. So it's a smaller conflict, but it's just as important as any other. These two photos here are actually taken from the Korean War Memorial that is in DC. I've been here. It's a very well done and beautiful monument to the men who fought and died and all that in Korea. Now, at the end of World War II, of course, the Soviets and the Chinese, those are our two big communist countries. They are basically expanding their ideas into Northern Korea. And what's basically going to happen is North Korea is going to be, Korea is going to be divided in half, first off. Okay? So the northern half is going to be under communist influence, and the southern half is going to be under democratic influence, primarily by the U.S. because we're stationed right there in Japan. We're occupying Japan. We're helping Japan rebuild and rebuilding good relations that continue to this day with Japan. So there's a strong influence from us in the south and a strong influence from Russia and China in the north. This is going to lead to a lot of issues because Koreans, they want to have a single united Korea. But which political ideology is going to win out? That's the question that is going to be tested. The country is divided along the 38th parallel, which is one of those lines of longitude that goes around the Earth from like east to west type of deal. All right. Basically divides it in half, and Kim Il-sung is the communist leader in the north, and Syngman Rhee, he is the leader in South Korea. All right. They both have their plans for unification under their own regimes, their own governments, and it's going to come to blows in 1950. All right. There are 3 phases in the war. The first part, of course, is North Korea. They invade, which is that first part that you see right now with these slides. We almost get kicked out. Then the UN gets in, primarily with US troops, pushes them all the way almost to the Chinese border. And then the Chinese get involved and push back. And then, as you see with that one of the last little slides there in that animation right there, that is where the border is today. There's almost no difference. It's only basically just a couple dozen miles or so between where the war began with the border and where it ended with the border. And thousands and thousands of people died. But one good thing that's going to happen during Korea, this is when the American military is desegregated. So black soldiers are fighting right alongside white soldiers, and it's going to help serve as an example that, races can work together. They can, work right alongside each other. There's no need for separation. So this is going to be one of those first major steps in civil rights for America. Now, Douglas MacArthur, he had a very, very crazy way of looking at the Korean War. He was in charge for the first part of it. He gets fired because he was basically making plans to nuke China because they were helping the North Koreans, but our hands were tied because it was never actually a declared war. It is what we would call a conflict, not a war, or a police action. So we're basically fighting with one hand tied behind our backs. In this way, I mean that we can only send troops into North Korea. We can't send them into China. We can't bomb anything in China, even though they are supplying tons of ammunition and soldiers from China. All right. So, yeah, he's going to be fired. He's going to be replaced with somebody who will follow the rules. Like MacArthur, he's a soldier. He's like, he sees the enemy. He's going to destroy the enemy. If I'm going to be completely honest, he would have started World War III by dropping nukes on China. All right. So the armistice, basically the ceasefire, that is basically right along the 38th parallel again. Would you say it's a success or it's a stalemate, the war? Kind of both. Like, the fact that containment worked, communism did not spread and take over the whole country, shows that containment is a policy that can work. Now, between North and South Korea, we have what is called the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. Basically, if anybody from North or South crosses that line, it could basically start the war up again. And that would happen all the way until just a few years ago, 2018 or 2019, I believe, when there were talks of even further, like, increasing the situation to where it would be peaceful and hopefully working towards a lasting peace between North and South Korea. But of course, that Kim Song Il, the guy who was the first communist leader, his son Kim Jong Il, and then his grandson Kim Jong Un, the guy who's in charge now in North Korea, they're all descendants of the same bloodlines, like the grandfather, the father, and the son. They have all been and are the dictators of North Korea. Right, just a little idea of what North and South Korea look like today through satellite imagery at nighttime. You can see there's not really much going on in North Korea, and that would be due to their economy is not very strong. They don't pretty much all their money goes into Pyongyang, the capital, and into the military and keeping people brainwashed essentially. Now, one of the big things with the Cold War that we have to talk about is the arms race. The arms race is half of the Cold War because everybody wants to have the biggest and baddest guns and bombs. So we're going to get the development of the hydrogen bomb, which is even more powerful than the atomic bombs that were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. Now, during the Cold War, this bomb right here, the Tsar Bomba, it was a Soviet hydrogen bomb. It is and still is the single most powerful nuclear weapon ever devised. It is 2,500 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. That is catastrophically powerful. Like, and you guys know just from some of the pictures I showed you, Hiroshima was leveled to the ground. This would have destroyed everything. Like, the whole city would have been vaporized. The countryside around it, for a pretty decent amount of distance, would have been vaporized and decimated as well. And there would have been a big hole in the ground. Now, just to help gauge it a little bit more, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, all the way there on the left side, and those were catastrophically sized bombs. The Tsar bomb, yeah, that's it's 10 times taller mushroom cloud from the explosion. The blast radius is many times bigger. Yeah, it's very, very destructive. And we don't want any of that happening. So, yeah, everybody's trying to make bigger and bigger bombs, and then we get that monster. We are also going to see the ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are missiles basically that you can launch from, say, California, and you could hit a target in Russia. You could launch it from New York. You could hit somewhere in Europe with it. So we're getting those. The Soviet Union is getting those. Our allies are getting those, like the British and the French. India is getting them. Iran is getting stuff like this. So many different countries who are allies with us and with the Soviet Union are getting their hands on these. We're also going to have nuclear-armed submarines. So the submarines, they're a lot harder to track than other things. So maybe we would end up sending one through the Mediterranean into the Black Sea, and then we could, launch a missile from a sub there and hit Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. All right. There would also be these multiple independent warheads. We would basically launch a rocket into the air, it would break apart, and there would be multiple bombs that would splinter out from it, and they would each hit individual targets, like different cities or different towns and areas, military bases, all from one projectile. Scary stuff. Now, both the United States and the Soviet Union would have a lot of spending going on during the Cold War, making bombs and bolstering up and building up the regular military infrastructure, such as equipping the soldiers with the best gear, the best guns, improving the tanks, firepower such as artillery, ships, planes, helicopters, all of this crazy warfare gear. Now, another strategy that we're going to have is deterrence. Basically, you let the enemy know that if they do something, you will not hesitate to retaliate and destroy them. That's what massive retaliation is, or MAD, mutual assured destruction. It's like, if you're going to bomb me, I'm going to bomb you, and everybody dies because we launch everything. All right, so one of the big goals was to push the enemy as far as you could to the edge before they would press the button for launching bombs. And that is brinkmanship. Make sure you keep that in your heads for vocabulary, brinkmanship. Now, next area that we're going to talk about is Cuba. What is going on in Cuba? I'm sure some of you guys might know that it did become a communist country. Here's how it happened. So there's going to be a revolution in the late 50s in Cuba, and it's going to be led by this guy right here, Fidel Castro, with heavy support from Che Guevara. These two guys are going to lead the communist revolution in Cuba, and they are going to win. And as an early retaliation and attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro, we're going to have what is called the Bay of Pigs invasion. So when the communists were coming to power, a lot of people from Cuba fled to the United States. They basically fled to Florida. So we welcomed them, and we provided training, military supplies, basically the majority of things that they would need. And we sent them back to Cuba in an attempt to basically create a war to liberate Cuba and start a revolution for bringing democracy back. The Bay of Pigs was a disaster. This is President John F. Kennedy basically waiting on the phone call to hear how the invasion went. The invasion never made it off the beach. They were killed, captured, or they retreated. It was just one of the biggest foul ups that could have happened. So Cuba is now officially a unchallengeable communist country. They are very heavily tied to the Soviet Union as of 1961. And that is Fidel Castro with Nikita Khrushchev, who is the Soviet premier, like their version of a president. And he was very happy that there's a communist country in the Western Hemisphere, and Cuba's only 90 miles from US soil. That's a very big advantage. All right. And he was also pretty diehard with taking on the US. So we're now going to get the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. Through spy satellites and aerial reconnaissance, the U.S. sees that there is missile facilities being built in Cuba. And we can basically tell what type of facilities they are. They're going to be for nuclear missiles. And they are going to be pointed where? Right at the U.S. So we see this. We know what's about to happen. We got to do something. We got to see who's going to blink first in that staring contest. So we're basically looking at all our options. You see President Kennedy on the side with the windows in the center. And these are all his advisors. Oh, you can actually see Robert F. Kennedy, his brother, over on the left side, the far left. And we are going to decide what we're going to do to prevent Cuba from getting these missiles. So what happens is we're going to blockade Cuba. We're going to have our Navy basically cut Cuba off from the Soviets and from anybody else for the most part. So It's basically the Russians have a ship, ships coming to Cuba with the nuclear missiles for delivery. Our ships are in the way, and it comes down to you're going to get out of here or we're going to attack. And then they're like, if you don't get out of our way, we're going to attack. And this is the single closest time the world ever came to World War III, like openly between the Soviet Union and the United States. So a deal is going to be struck because nobody wants this war. Nobody on either side. Because mutually assured destruction. So many deaths would have occurred had the wrong thing been done with this event. So what's going to happen is the Soviets are going to remove all missiles and equipment from Cuba in exchange for the US allowing Cuba to be communist and just basically not try and invade and overthrow the communist government there, as well as us removing some missiles from Turkey that we had stationed there. That one was pretty much kept out of the press, but it has since been released, like to the general public. Now, what happens after the missile crisis? In the years following, we are going to basically see Khrushchev he falls out of favor with the Soviet Union and he gets replaced. People are building fallout shelters, or at least not as many now, in the U.S. Basically to be prepared in case a nuclear bomb gets dropped. Now, there's going to be some test bans for bombs. So governments and militaries were testing nuclear bombs in the atmosphere, above ground, in the oceans, poisoning stuff all over the place. Those types of tests are no longer allowed, but as long as the bomb is buried underground or shot down a tunnel that goes down a significant depth, it can be tested that way to see what happens. So that's like the only thing that can still happen, as far as I know. But yeah. Now, we're going to do just a little intro to the Vietnam War, and we will continue the majority of discussion on Vietnam, basically U.S. involvement in Vietnam, which is through most of the conflict, next time. But okay, so Vietnam is in Southeast Asia, south of China, and it was a French colony in Asia. So it's known as French Indochina. And Southeast Asia has a long history of being under other people's control. So the Chinese throughout most of the 1800s had influence there. The French through the first couple of decades of the 1900s. The Japanese occupied it during World War II and some years before that, like in the 30s. And the French had it basically from the 40s up until they were kicked out in the 50s. And we were basically there from in small capacity in the 50s up into the 70s. So we're going to basically get our story from the French and the US. Now, the First Indochina War, this is basically Vietnam Part 1. This is the French versus the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh are the Vietnamese revolutionaries, and they are wanting to fight for a united, independent Vietnam. Now, the French, they're doing the fighting on the side of, the democratic side and trying to hold on to their territory there. And we are providing the money for paying that bill. We paid a good 80% of that war. And it's going to be a disaster because 9 years later, the French surrender after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where they were just surrounded and overrun, leading to Vietnam winning its independence. And we're going to see a division. Just like with Korea on the 30th parallel, Vietnam is going to be divided on the 17th parallel, where the North is going to be under the communist leadership of Ho Chi Minh, and the South is going to be under basically a puppet government of the U.S. So it's going to be democratic, capitalist, and all, but they basically do whatever we say because that's when we start to get involved. All right, so this is where we're going to stop today. We will pick up with Vietnam in the next video. All right, talk to you guys later.